It was a quiet Saturday morning when I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, ready to start the day. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. But as soon as I glanced toward my backyard, I stopped dead, in my tracks. There, lining the edge of my fence, were rows of newly planted trees. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was imagining things. But no, they were real. Tall, leafy trees, their trunks still fresh with the smell of newly planted soil. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and walked closer. These weren't the trees I had planted. These weren't trees that had been there the day before. Confusion turned to irritation as I realized something else. The sign, sticking out of the ground near the base of the trees, read HOA Neighborhood Beautification Project. Of course, I should have known. The Homeowners Association, that group of well-dressed busybodies who thought they could control every little aspect of my life, had done this without asking, without even a heads up. I stood there for a moment, seething, my fists clenching. But then, as I looked closer at the trees, something else caught my eye, something that made my heart drop. These trees weren't just any ordinary trees. These were invasive species, plants that could destroy the local ecosystem and disrupt everything in the neighborhood. I turned sharply and headed for the phone, my mind racing. Who gave them permission to plant these? Why hadn't anyone informed? Me? The HOA was always overstepping its bounds, but this was different. This wasn't just a new rule about lawn care. This was about my property, my land, and the future of this entire neighborhood. The thought of the damage those trees could do made my stomach turn. As if I didn't have enough to worry about, now the HOA was putting everything at risk. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking with anger as I dialed the HOA office. The ringing felt like an eternity, each ring hammering away at my resolve. Finally, someone picked up. "Hello, HOA office. This is Karen. How can I assist you?" she said. Her voice, smooth, almost too polite. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Karen, this is Robert Carter from Willow Grove Lane. I just saw that the HOA has planted trees along my property, and I need to know why they were put there without my consent. These trees, they're invasive species, and they could destroy the local ecosystem." There was a brief pause on the other end. When Karen responded, her tone had shifted, but it was annoyingly calm, as though she were reading from a script. "We're sorry for the confusion, Mr. Carter. The trees are part of a neighborhood beautification initiative. It's a community effort to improve the area. There's no reason to worry about the trees. They've been planted to enhance the neighborhood." Could feel my frustration rising with every word she spoke. "No, you don't understand. These trees are invasive. They spread quickly and could destroy the natural flora in the area. You can't just plant them without permission. You've violated my property rights," she sighed softly, her tone patronizing now. "I assure you, Mr. Carter, there's no cause for alarm. The trees were chosen for their hardiness and aesthetic value. The HOA has already planned the rest of the planting, and it's not something we can undo at this point." I clenched my jaw, staring at the trees outside. They stood there, silent but ominous. It was as if the HOA didn't even care. No one seemed to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about trees. It was about power, control, and their complete disregard for the environment and the people who lived here. I could already tell this wasn't going to be easy. The HOA was digging in their heels, and I was the one left fighting for my land. "Karen, I'm not backing down. You've made a mistake, and I won't let it slide," I said, my voice tight with determination. Her response was clipped, a finality to it. "We'll have to discuss this at the next community meeting, Mr. Carter." I hung up, the weight of her indifference still hanging heavy in the air. The seeds of this fight had been planted, and the HOA's lack of urgency to correct their mistake only made the situation worse. As much as I wanted to back down, I knew I couldn't. This wasn't just about the trees. It was about standing up for what was right. The HOA had made their move, but I was ready to make mine. The next few days felt like a never-ending cycle of frustration. I spent hours researching the trees that the HOA had so thoughtlessly planted in my yard. The more I dug, the worse it became. At first I thought maybe I was overreacting, but as I looked into the species of trees they had chosen, my stomach churned. The more I learned, the clearer it became. They weren't just invasive, they were a ticking time bomb. These trees had the potential to spread rapidly, choking out the Native plants, disrupting the ecosystem and affecting the water table of the entire neighborhood. The more I read, the more I realize just how serious the situation was. I couldn't just let it go. I reached out to a local botanist, hoping for some expert insight. After explaining my concerns, the botanist agreed to meet with me the following day. When I walked into his office, he was busy with plant samples and research notes. As I sat down, he listened patiently, nodding in acknowledgement of my worries. "These trees," he began slowly, "are incredibly aggressive. They'll take over quickly and spread far beyond where they're planted. Their roots can choke out other plants, and they've been known to change the composition of the soil, making it inhospitable for other species. This isn't just a bad decision. It's a disaster waiting to happen." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had hoped for some reassurance, but instead, I had been handed a list of reasons why the HOA's actions were reckless and dangerous. As he handed me a report outlining the ecological dangers these trees posed, I felt my resolve harden. This wasn't just a disagreement with the HOA. This was about protecting the community, the neighborhood I called home. I knew I had to act, but part of me hesitated. I had heard rumors about how difficult it was to challenge the HOA. People had tried before, only to be silenced by threats or subtle coercion. They controlled everything, the local bylaws, the property values, even the way we lived. But I couldn't let that fear hold me back. The stakes were too high. Over the next few days, I began collecting evidence. I made calls to local government offices, asking about the laws regarding invasive species and property rights. I reached out to environmental groups for support. Every piece of information I gathered painted a clearer picture of the HOA's negligence. But something was nagging at me. Why had they planted these trees in the first place? It didn't make sense. This wasn't just about beautification or community spirit. There had to be another motive. I began digging into the HOA's recent decisions, looking for any signs of financial gain or political influence. It didn't take long for me to find the first red flag. The HOA had recently approved a series of community improvements, including landscaping projects that seemed to be focused on altering the neighborhood's visual appeal. But the more I researched, the more it became clear. These trees were a key part of a plan to artificially increase property values. They weren't just beautifying the area. They were manipulating the landscape to boost their profits, regardless of the environmental consequences. I felt a deep sense of betrayal. The HOA wasn't just ignorant of the ecological damage they were causing. They were knowingly putting the community at risk for their own gain. They had taken something as simple as planting trees and twisted it into a financial strategy, all while disregarding the residents who had trusted them to care for the neighborhood. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just about the trees anymore. This was about power, manipulation, and the future of the place I had called home. My phone rang, snapping me back to reality. It was the HOA again. The message was clear. This fight was far from over, but neither was my determination. If the HOA thought they could get away with this, they were in for a fight. I was ready to stand up and expose the truth, no matter the cost. The community meeting room was packed. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating as every eye in the room turned toward me. The HOA board sat at the front, their faces masked with polite but unreadable expressions. Karen, the president, sat with her arms folded, her lips drawn into a tight smile that barely concealed the underlying arrogance. I stood in front of the board, my hands shaking as I gripped the stack of documents and research I had gathered over the past few weeks. Every page I held was a piece of proof, a piece of my determination to take back control. The room fell silent as I began, my voice loud enough to fill the space but steady with barely contained anger. "These trees," I said, pointing at the images of the invasive species I had printed out, "are a threat, a danger to the ecosystem, to the local wildlife, and to the homes of every person in this neighborhood. And you, the HOA, planted them on my property without my consent. But it gets worse. These trees were planted knowing full well that they would cause irreparable harm." I slammed the stack of documents onto the table in front of Karen. She flinched, slightly, but quickly regained her composure. The others on the board exchanged glances, but they said nothing. I could see it in their eyes. Their discomfort was palpable. They had underestimated me, and now it was too late to turn back. "Mr. Carter," Karen spoke up, her voice smooth and calculated. "I think you're overreacting. The trees are part of a beautification project. They've been approved by the board, and there's no reason to worry. They'll blend in just fine. Everyone will benefit from the improvements to the neighborhood." I couldn't hold it in anymore. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "You think I'm overreacting? You think I'm just being difficult? Let me tell you something. These trees are invasive species. I've spoken with botanists, environmentalists, even local government officials. They spread. They destroy local ecosystems. They choke out other plant life and destroy the environment for wildlife. You planted these trees because you thought they'd make the neighborhood look nice, but you didn't care about the damage they'd cause. You never cared about that." The room fell even quieter, the weight of my words sinking in. Karen's face remained tight, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for the papers in front of her, pretending to scan through them. She wasn't ready to back down. "I don't know where you're getting your information from, but our plan was thoroughly researched," she said, her voice strained. "These trees were selected because they're hardy and aesthetically pleasing. They'll add value to the neighborhood, increase property values, and improve our public spaces. I assure you, Mr. Carter, we've done everything by the book." Her words were hollow, and I could see the cracks starting to form. She wasn't being truthful. She wasn't just dismissing my concerns. She was covering something up. I leaned forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're lying," I said, my voice low but firm. "You knew exactly what you were doing. These trees weren't just chosen for their looks. You planted them for financial gain. You thought that by artificially improving the landscape, you could increase property values for your own benefit. You've been manipulating this whole neighborhood to serve your interests." The room was silent, but I could feel the eyes of the others on me now. Some were looking at Karen, others at each other. A few had begun shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was out in the open, and it couldn't be ignored any longer. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment, and it was all the confirmation I needed. I had struck a nerve. She quickly masked it with a forced laugh, but I could see through it. The board members were starting to question her, their loyalty slipping away. "You think we planted these trees for financial gain?" Karen sneered. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Mr. Carter. The HOA is here to improve this community, not destroy it. You're turning something good into something personal." I shook my head, my anger bubbling up again. "This is personal. You don't get to manipulate the entire neighborhood for your own benefit. You don't get to put the environment and the people at risk just to raise property values. And you sure as hell don't get to use my property without my consent." The board was visibly rattled now, and Karen's composure was slipping. I could tell that the truth was beginning to spread through the room like wildfire. They hadn't expected me to dig this deep. They hadn't expected me to uncover the motive behind their so-called beautification project. One of the board members, a middle-aged man in a suit, finally spoke up. "I think we need to reconsider this entire project. Maybe we should look into the environmental impact more seriously." The tension in the room thickened as the others exchanged uneasy glances. Karen was no longer the confident leader she had been just moments ago. She was rattled, and for the first time, I could see the cracks in the HOA's armor. "You can't just undo what you've done," I said, my voice steady. "But you can be held accountable, and I will make sure of it. These trees will be removed, and you will face the consequences of your actions. This isn't just a fight about landscaping. It's about protecting the future of this neighborhood, and I'll be damned if I let you destroy it for your own profit." The board members were starting to nod, some of them agreeing with me, some hesitating. But the damage had been done. The truth was out. Karen's facade of control was crumbling, and I knew that the battle wasn't over, but it had already shifted in my favor. The fight for the neighborhood, for the environment, and for my land had only just begun. After months of legal battles and public hearings, the decision had finally come. The HOA had been forced to remove the invasive trees at their own expense. The board members sat quietly, their once confident demeanor now replaced with nervous glances and tight lips as the judge delivered the ruling. The fine was steep, and an amount that would significantly hurt their funds. But the consequences went beyond just the financial hit. Their reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and they could no longer walk into the community with the same authority they once held. Their grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and I had taken the first step in tearing it away from them. I stood outside my property the next morning, watching as the trucks rolled in, hauling the invasive trees away one by one. The machinery hummed in the background, each tree being ripped out with efficiency and care. The very trees that had threatened to alter the land, to choke out the life I had worked so hard to protect, were now being removed like weeds from a garden. It felt like a small victory, but one that had been years in the making. As the last tree was loaded onto a truck and driven away, I couldn't help but smile. We had won, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The fight had started over a few trees, but it had grown into something far more important, a battle for justice, for the future of the community, and for the preservation of what was rightfully ours. I had stood up when it mattered, and I had fought not just for my property, but for the people who had been too scared to speak out. Looking around, I saw the change. The neighborhood felt different. It felt like the community was taking back control, that we had all come together to push back against the forces that tried to manipulate us. The HOA no longer had the power they once had, and the trust we had, lost in them, could never be repaired. I had learned something about myself in this process. It wasn't just about being right. It was about standing firm, even when the odds seemed impossible. I had protected my land, but more importantly, I had protected the future of the community, and that, I realized, was worth every fight, every sleepless night, and every moment of doubt. As I stood in my backyard, the sun setting behind the now empty space where the trees had once stood, a wave of relief washed over me. The air felt different, clearer, freer, as if the weight of the past few months had been lifted. I had spent so much time fighting for what was right, for my property, and for the community. But in those final moments, as I watched the trucks roll away with the last of the trees, I realized it wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about something much bigger, standing up for what's right, even when the odds were stacked against you. The fight had been long, and at times it had felt like I was pushing against an immovable force. But through every setback, every confrontation, I had learned more about myself, about my strength, and the importance of community. I had gone from being an individual, a homeowner, trying to protect his land, to someone who had united a community to take back control from the very people who were supposed to protect us. The neighborhood had changed, but so had I. I walked down the now peaceful street, where the sounds of construction had been replaced with the gentle hum of life, the quiet, reassuring sound of neighbors coming together. We had reclaimed our community. My land was safe again, the trees gone, and the HOA no longer had the power to control us. I had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, I had helped protect not just my property, but the future of everyone around me. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.